You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court made a pivotal decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. They said it was acceptable to have separate facilities for different races, as long as those facilities were equal in quality. This notion is what we now refer to as separate but equal. This ruling supported the segregation laws, often called Jim Crow laws, that were widespread in the southern United States after the Reconstruction era ended in 1877. A segregation sanctioned by law persisted in the South well into the 1960s. The whole thing started when Homer Plessy, who was of mixed race, decided to challenge these segregation laws by sitting in a train car designated for white people only. He did this in New Orleans back in 1892. Plessy was doing this to stand up against the Separate Car Act of 1890 in Louisiana, a law that said white and non-white passengers had to have equal but separate train accommodations. Plessy ended up being arrested, and at his trial his lawyers argued that the law was unconstitutional. But Judge John Howard Ferguson and later the Louisiana Supreme Court disagreed. When Plessy's case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices ruled by a majority of 7-1 against Plessy. They said the Louisiana law didn't go against the 14th Amendment, which is the part of the Constitution that says whites and blacks are legally equal. The court stated that this amendment didn't require the removal of all racial distinctions. They also didn't buy the argument that the law suggested black people were inferior. The justices stood by the power of states to make certain types of laws, including those relating to health, safety, and morals. Justice John Marshall Harlan strongly disagreed with the ruling. He famously said the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens, arguing that the law should have been seen as unconstitutional because it differentiated between passengers based on race. Plessy v. Ferguson is often seen as one of the Supreme Court's biggest mistakes. Although it hasn't been outright overturned, subsequent rulings, starting with the landmark 1954 case Brown v. Board of Education, have significantly weakened the separate but equal stance. The Brown case declared that in the context of public schools, separate but equal is definitely unconstitutional. The Library of Congress mentions that the Plessy decision wasn't explicitly overturned until the case of Bob Jones University versus the United States. Back in 1890, Louisiana's government established a regulation known as the Separate Car Act, which stipulated that black individuals and white individuals were required to sit in distinct sections on the state's trains. Train staff were directed to seat passengers in the designated areas for their respective races. Any person who attempted to sit in the incorrect section could incur a fine of $25 or be subject to a maximum of 20 days in jail. A group of well-known New Orleans residents, comprising individuals of varying racial heritages, opposed this legislation and formed an organization called the Comité des Citoyens, translating to Committee of Citizens. Their objective was to abolish the Separate Car Act and prevent its enforcement. They enlisted Homer Plessy to assist them in taking a stand. Plessy, of mixed white and black descent, appeared white, but by law, he was classified as black. On June 7, 1892, Plessy executed their scheme. He purchased a first-class ticket and boarded a train carriage earmarked for white individuals only. The railroad company also opposed the Separate Car Act because it necessitated the purchase of additional train carriages. Thus, being aware of Plessy's ethnic background and the committee's intention to contest the law, they cooperated with the plan. To ensure the strategy unfolded as planned, the committee even employed a detective with the authority to arrest Plessy. Consequently, Plessy occupied a seat in the white-only carriage, refused to move upon request, and was arrested, fulfilling their intended course of action. The train made a halt. Plessy was removed at the intersection of Press and Royal Streets, and subsequently he had to stand trial for his actions. Homer Adolph Plessy made a legal request to the State District Criminal Court to dismiss his case, claiming that a Louisiana law requiring the segregation of train cars violated his constitutional rights. Specifically, he cited the 13th and 14th Amendments, which guarantee equality under the law. However, Judge John Howard Ferguson, overseeing the case, decided that the state of Louisiana had the right to regulate railroad companies within its territory. Plessy did not stop there, and quickly sought to halt his criminal trial by requesting assistance from the Louisiana Supreme Court. The Louisiana Supreme Court initially paused the trial to review the case but ultimately sided with Judge Ferguson and declined a second review when Plessy's lawyers requested it. Justice Charles Erasmus Fenner, speaking for the court, referenced previous cases to support the decision, including one from Massachusetts in 1849 that sanctioned segregated schools, and another from Pennsylvania that ruled separating races in rail cars did not imply one race was inferior to another. Plessy and his legal team persisted and escalated their battle to the United States Supreme Court. Lawyers Albion W. Turgee, James C. Walker, Samuel F. Phillips, and F. D. McKinney submitted 2 comprehensive arguments on his behalf. When the case was heard in court on April 13, 1896, Turgee and Phillips presented their points in person. They argued that Plessy's rights under the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment were infringed upon. Turgee claimed that the harm to Plessy's reputation due to his race equated to a loss of property, and suggested that the segregation law implied racial inferiority. Oppositely, Louisiana's position was presented by Attorney General Milton Joseph Cunningham, an avid proponent of white supremacy. Remarkably, a 1916 obituary praised his efforts during the Reconstruction era to reinstate white political control, efforts that once resulted in his arrest and trial by federal authorities, along with several others. On May 18, 1896, the United States Supreme Court made a decision, by a vote of 7-1, that it was constitutional for Louisiana to have laws that separate people by race in train cars. The main opinion in the court was written by Justice Henry Billings Brown. The court first stated that the Louisiana law did not violate the 13th Amendment. This amendment was put in place to ensure that Black Americans had the same basic legal rights as everyone else, which was necessary to abolish slavery. Then the court examined the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause, which states that governments should not deny anyone the equal protection of the laws. The court explained that although the 14th Amendment was intended to ensure all races in the United States were treated the same legally, it was not designed to abolish social discrimination or to enforce a mandatory social mixing of races in ways that might be objectionable to either group. The majority stated, the objective of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races under conditions disagreeable to either. The court also reasoned that laws about racial separation were part of the state's inherent power, the authority to enact laws concerning public health, safety, and morals. It suggested that as long as these separation laws were a reasonable exercise of that power, and they were not enacted to oppress anyone, then they did not violate the Equal Protection Clause. The states were granted a broad latitude in deciding what was reasonable. The attorneys for Plessy argued that by separating the races, the implication was that black people were inferior, which meant the law was in violation of the Equal Protection Clause by marking black people with a badge of inferiority. The court, however, disagreed with this argument and dismissed it. The court said, "We consider the underlying error of the plaintiff's argument to lie in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races brands the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this is the case, it is not because of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to interpret it that way." In conclusion, the court stated that the law did not inherently make black Americans inferior. They believed that racial prejudice was not an issue that could be addressed through legislation. How Justice John Marshall Harlan stood alone in disagreement with the Supreme Court's decision. He strongly challenged the court's view that the Louisiana law did not suggest black people were seen as inferior. Harlan accused the majority of intentionally overlooking the issue. He made it clear that everyone understood the true purpose of the law in question. It wasn't really about keeping white people from the train cars used by black individuals, but rather about making sure black people were kept out of cars designated for white patrons. Harlan stressed that the intention was to make black people stay separate under the pretext of providing equal facilities. He asserted that no truthful person could claim otherwise. To strengthen his argument, Harlan highlighted an exception within the Louisiana law for nurses caring for children of a different race. Essentially, this meant that black nannies to white children could ride in train cars reserved for white people. According to Harlan, This revealed that the law only accepted black individuals in white-only cars when their roles clearly marked them as servants. In a significant statement, Harlan contended that although late 19th century white Americans often saw themselves as superior to other races, the Constitution did not differentiate between citizens based on color, especially in regards to legal rights and civil liberties. He quoted, "The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, but in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens." Harlan affirmed the Constitution is colorblind, and it does not acknowledge any class among citizens. He argued for equality before the law, saying that the humblest is the peer of the most powerful. Finally, Harlan predicted that the Plessy decision would become as condemned as the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision of 1857. That earlier ruling claimed black Americans could not be citizens and were not entitled to constitutional protections. Following the decision of the Supreme Court, the trial for Homer Plessy proceeded in Judge Ferguson's courtroom in Louisiana, and the date was February 11, 1897. When it was his turn, Plessy admitted to the charges, saying he was guilty of breaking the Separate Car Act. This law was the one that stated black and white passengers had to sit in separate railway cars. The penalty for going against this act was either paying $25 or spending 20 days behind bars. Plessy chose to pay the fine. Not long after this trial concluded, the Committee of Citizens, the group that supported Plessy, dissolved and stopped working together. The Plessy case set a precedent that validated the segregation laws in the South, sparking further discriminatory legislation. This case also reinforced segregation in the North, as referenced in Boston's school segregation incident by Justice Brown's majority opinion. The progress made during Reconstruction was undone, with the separate but equal principle erasing legislative gains. Additionally, a 1875 Supreme Court ruling limited the federal government's power, essentially allowing states to enact racially discriminatory laws without much interference, as long as they appeared equal in nature. Despite the notion of equality, facilities for non-whites were typically subpar or non-existent. This development concerned advocates of equality, like Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, who warned it would lead to weaker protections for civil rights, an outcome that became evident through the widespread Jim Crow laws. Not all view Harlan's dissenting opinion positively. Scholars like Gabriel J. Chin and Eric Malt suggest it should be seen within the context of his broader judicial record. They highlight troubling aspects, such as Harlan's remarks about the Chinese, and note contradictions in his stance on race. Author Keith Weldon Medley points out that some phrases in Harlan's famous dissent actually came from the Citizens Committee's documents presented to the court. The Plessy ruling immediately affected funding for segregated schools, with black schools suffering from a lack of resources. In Lum v. Rice, 1927, the Supreme Court supported a school's decision to bar a Chinese-American girl, maintaining the influence of Plessy and encouraging segregation to take root even outside the South. Between 1890 and 1908, Southern states pushed laws that disenfranchised both blacks and poor whites, undermining political progress made during and after Reconstruction. Voting became difficult for many due to new requirements implemented by these laws. Historian Roger Smith comments that such measures were openly intended to restrict voting to whites, defiantly ignoring constitutional amendments. The ruling in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 finally declared school segregation unconstitutional, although it didn't specifically overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. Later civil rights legislation and court decisions, such as the Interstate Commerce Commission's ruling in 1955 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, marked a formal end to legalized segregation and voter discrimination. The Plessy and Ferguson Foundation was established in 2009 by Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, descendants from the Plessy case, to promote education and reconciliation around the history of civil rights. That same year, a historical marker was installed in New Orleans at the site where Homer Plessy was arrested. In a move of restorative justice, the Louisiana Board of Pardons approved a posthumous pardon for Plessy in 2021, which was finalized by Governor John Bell Edwards in early 2022. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.